Welcome to Family Shadows, a place where the hidden corners of family life come into light. Here, we tell stories that touch the heart, stories that remind us of the sacrifices we often overlook and the quiet strength of love, loyalty, and sometimes heartbreak. If stories like these speak to your heart, I invite you, join our family here. Subscribe and let us walk together through tales that may reflect pieces of your own life. Today's story is called, "They Told Me I Wasn't Part of the Family Anymore, so I Took Back My Name." Edward Lane had lived 65 years with the kind of face that time itself etched into permanence. His eyes, pale blue, were soft with the years but carried the firmness of a man who had built things with his own two hands. Not just buildings, though he had built plenty. He had built a family, a company, and a name. That name, Lane, wasn't just a word on paper. It was a promise. It was the name people in town whispered when they pointed to a house that never leaked, a foundation that never cracked, a structure that stood against wind and storm. Lane Builders, the company's sign read. But for Edward, it was more than a sign. It was his life's testament. And yet, on that quiet November evening, standing in his living room where the light from the lamp fell golden on the wall of photographs, he discovered that even promises could be erased. The photo had been framed just last week. It was a new family portrait. His son Andrew, his daughter Laura, and Laura's husband Peter. Their children, his grandchildren, sat in the front row, smiling the rehearsed smiles children wear when photographers count to 3. Everyone looked polished, dressed in autumn shades. Edward studied the photo for a long moment. At first, he smiled, proud of their posture, the way Andrew had grown into his father's shoulders, the way Laura resembled Helen, his late wife. But then his eyes dropped to the inscription carved into the brass plate at the bottom. It read, "The Lane Family 2025. Only one name was missing. Not Andrew's, not Laura's, not even Peter's, who had married into the bloodline. It was his. There was no mention of Edward Lane. For a long while he simply stood there, one hand resting on the wooden frame, the silence of the room swelling around him. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches of the old oak Helen once loved. He could almost hear her voice, faint and warm, reminding him to let small things go. But this didn't feel small. A vibration broke the silence. His phone lit up on the table, a family group message. He tapped it open, half smiling, expecting some cheerful reminder about Thanksgiving plans. Laura's words stared back. "From now on, all decisions will be discussed within the family." The word family hung in his mind like a blade. It should have included him. It always had. But in that single line, he realized what they meant. Family now meant everyone except Edward. Edward lowered himself into his armchair, the one Helen used to tease him about for swallowing him whole. He stared at the ceiling, the fan turning lazily. 65 years of carrying a name, of giving everything he had, and now he felt as if his very existence had been deleted with the swipe of a pen. He thought of Helen. She had passed away a decade earlier, yet her presence lingered in the house. The photographs, the recipe cards still stacked neatly in the kitchen drawer, the lavender scent clinging faintly to the blanket folded at the end of their bed. Helen had always believed in the sanctity of names. A name, she once told him as they painted the wooden board for his first office, isn't just for recognition. It's a covenant. It's what binds you to the people who trust you. And so Edward had kept the Lane name pure, never cheating a client, never cutting corners. Even when it meant smaller profits, he'd done the right thing, because Helen was right. A name was not currency, it was legacy. Yet here he was, erased from his own family's inscription. It might have ended as just a wound, a bitter sting of pride, had it not been for the memory that followed. Years earlier, Helen had convinced him to register the company's trademark in his own name. "Just in case," she had said, with that gentle foresight wives often carry. At the time, he'd laughed, dismissing the thought of betrayal from his children. But now he wondered. That night, Edward did not sleep much. He sat at his desk, opening drawers, leafing through folders yellowed with time. There, beneath an old photograph of Helen in her garden, he found the envelope. Inside, the official papers, the trademark of Lane Builders, the name Lane secured under his ownership, Helen's signature at the witness line, her handwriting still graceful even as illness had weakened her hand. Edward's fingers trembled as he held the papers. He realized in that moment that Helen had seen this day before he ever did. But before papers, before lawyers, before battles over rights and names, there was still the wound of the evening, still the photo frame on the wall, polished and gleaming with his absence louder than any presence. Edward rose from his chair, walked back to the photo and placed his palm against the glass. "You can erase me from your frame," he whispered softly, his voice breaking in the still room, "but you cannot erase me from who I am." The following week, Edward drove slowly to the office he had once built with nothing but savings and sweat. The glass facade gleamed brighter than he remembered, polished by a team of janitors who hadn't been there in his day. Back then, it had been just him, Helen, and a handful of workers, men with dusty boots and lunch pails who believed in him because he treated them like brothers. Now the building looked more like a bank than a construction firm. Digital screens in the lobby flashed charts of growth, new contracts and slogans Edward didn't recognize. "Innovation for tomorrow," one read. Another said, "Building beyond boundaries." The word Lane, once painted proudly on every wall, was smaller now, tucked beneath slick logos that made the company look like it sold software instead of homes. Edward paused at the doorway of the main conference room. Through the glass, he saw his son Andrew at the head of the table, sharp suit, hair perfectly parted. His voice carried confidence, no authority, that Edward barely recognized. On Andrew's right sat Laura, her arms folded, her gaze fixed on the spreadsheets in front of her. Beside her, Peter Grant typed rapidly into a laptop, whispering numbers into Laura's ear. The seats around the table were full, except for one. The chair where Edward used to sit had been pushed aside, as if no one dared touch it, yet no one invited him back into it either. He opened the door quietly, a habit of a man who had always believed in courtesy. The conversation inside stuttered for a moment. Andrew looked up, and though his lips curved into something that might have been a smile, his eyes said otherwise. "Dad," Andrew said, as though addressing a guest who had walked into the wrong room, "we're in the middle of something important." Edward nodded. "I'll just sit and listen." He pulled out the chair that had been pushed aside and lowered himself into it. For a moment, silence stretched. Then Peter cleared his throat and went back to the numbers. "We're finalizing the rebranding strategy," Peter said. "Investors are pushing for a fresher image. They want us to distance from the legacy feel." The word legacy landed heavy in Edward's ears. Legacy was what he thought he had been building all along. Legacy was the reason he had poured his back into foundations, his hands into brick and wood. Legacy had Helen's laughter woven into it, the children's initials carved on beams of unfinished houses when they were little. Andrew leaned forward. "Dad, this is just business. Times change. Clients don't want an old-fashioned name, they want modern." Edward swallowed slowly. "Old-fashioned." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Yes, we're phasing out the old signage. The new logo drops Lane Builders. It'll just be next-gen construction. Cleaner, sharper." The words cut through him like a blade. His own son was erasing the very name that had raised him, clothed him, sent him to college. He thought of the nights he and Helen stayed awake worrying about payroll, how they had cut their own meals short so the workers' families could eat. He remembered the day Andrew graduated, how Edward had shaken his hand and said, "This is yours one day. Carry it with pride." And now here was Andrew cutting the roots from the tree that had fed him. Edward did not raise his voice. He never did. Instead, he looked down at his hands, still strong despite the veins showing like rivers under his skin. He placed them flat on the table and whispered almost to himself. This company was never just numbers. It was people. It was trust. It was a promise under my name, and you want to strip that away. Laura leaned forward. "Dad, don't take it personally. It's just the direction we need. You've done enough. It's time to let go." Let go. Two words that sounded like mercy but carried the sting of exile. Edward stood, sliding the chair back without a sound. He looked at each of them: Andrew, the son who bore his shoulders but not his patience; Laura, whose face still reminded him of Helen but whose voice was cold steel; Peter, the outsider who now whispered louder than Edward's own blood. "I see," Edward said softly. "You have no more need for the Lane name." And with that he left the room. That night, Edward sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning. He opened the wooden box Helen had left him, the one he rarely touched. Inside, beneath her jewelry and a pressed flower from their wedding bouquet, lay the folder with the legal documents, the trademark of the Lane name, his name. He traced Helen's handwriting on the witness line, tears stinging his eyes. She had always been the visionary. She had known that one day even children could forget the shoulders they stood on. He whispered into the quiet kitchen, "Helen, they think they can erase me, but you saw this day coming, and you gave me the way to remind them." He folded the papers back carefully, slid them into his briefcase, and for the first time in years, felt the kind of resolve that comes not from anger but from dignity. The next morning, Edward Lane dressed slowly, the way men of his age did when there was no one left in the house to hurry them. He buttoned his shirt in silence, tugged his old wool jacket over his shoulders, and picked up the leather briefcase he had carried for 40 years. The handle was cracked with age, but the weight of it felt familiar, grounding. Inside, carefully wrapped in a manila envelope, were the documents that might change everything. The law office of Mason Clark sat in the center of town, a brick building that had survived decades of storms, renovations, and changing storefronts. Edward had passed it thousands of times, never thinking he'd one day walk through its doors for himself. When he entered, the receptionist looked up with polite recognition. "Mr. Lane," she said softly, as though the name itself carried history. She pointed him toward the office at the end of the hall. Mason Clark rose as Edward entered. He was a man in his 50s, with thinning hair and glasses perched at the edge of his nose. They had known each other in passing, but this meeting was different. "Edward," Mason said warmly, extending his hand. "It's been a long time." Edward nodded, shaking it firmly. "Yes, and I'm afraid this isn't a social call." They sat across from each other. The desk between them was tidy, stacks of neatly clipped documents arranged with lawyerly precision. Edward placed the envelope on top and slid it across. Mason opened it carefully, scanning the first few pages. His eyebrows rose as he flipped through the papers. Trademark registration, original owner, Edward Lane, witnessed and notarized, dated, my goodness, over 30 years ago. And here, he tapped the page, renewed on schedule, still active. Edward leaned back, folding his hands. Helen insisted on it. She said a name wasn't just something you give away, not even to your own children. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Now, his voice trailed off. Mason adjusted his glasses, studying Edward. "You realize what this means?" Edward's silence was answer enough. "It means," Mason continued, "that Lane Builders doesn't actually have the right to use the name without your permission. They've been operating under your personal license all these years. And because of this clause," he flipped to a highlighted section, "you can terminate that license at any time, especially if you believe the usage goes against the values under which it was created." Edward exhaled slowly. The words sat heavy, not with triumph but with inevitability. Mason leaned forward. "Edward, this is powerful leverage, but it's not without consequence. Are you sure this is the step you want to take? These are your children." The word children pierced Edward more deeply than any legal jargon. He saw Andrew's boyish grin the day he first carried a toolbox, Laura's small hands clutching his neck as he hoisted her onto unfinished beams. He saw Helen standing between them, proud of the family they were raising. "They told me," Edward said softly, "that I'm not part of the family anymore. They removed my name from the wall, from the photo, from the company I built. If I let that stand, then my name, our name, Helen's name, becomes theirs to twist. I won't allow that, not for myself, for her." Mason studied him a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'll proceed. The first step is a formal letter, revoking their license. Once it's delivered, they'll have 30 days to remove the Lane name from every sign, every document, every contract." Edward nodded, his gaze steady. Do it. As Mason drafted the letter, Edward's thoughts wandered back to Helen. He remembered the night they had painted the first sign together. The wood had been rough, the paint sticky, but Helen had insisted on writing the letters herself. Her brush strokes were slow, careful, reverent. Lane Builders, she had murmured as she painted. Not just because it's your name, Edward, but because it's ours. And one day when Andrew and Laura are older, they'll understand what it means to carry something honest. Now, sitting in Mason's office, Edward felt the echo of that promise. His children hadn't understood. Perhaps they never would, but he would not let the name become hollow. When Mason finally slid the draft across the desk, Edward read it carefully. The words were simple, clinical, stripped of emotion. Effective immediately, the license granted to Lane Builders, Inc. to use the trademark name Lane is hereby terminated. The company is instructed to cease all use of the name in branding, signage, contracts, and representation within 30 days of receipt of this notice. At the bottom was a line for his signature. Edward picked up the pen. For a moment his hand trembled. He wasn't trembling from fear, but from the weight of the decision. This was not a father punishing his children. This was a man reclaiming the promise of his life's work. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed, Edward Lane. The name flowed as it always had, steady and true. When Edward returned home that afternoon, the house felt different. Not lighter, not darker, but somehow firmer, as though the walls themselves knew he had taken back something that belonged within them. He sat in the quiet living room, staring again at the family photo on the wall. The brass plate still gleamed without his name, but now, for the first time, Edward didn't feel erased. He felt anchored. "You saw this coming, Helen," he whispered. "And I listened too late, but not too late to set it right." Outside, the sky was shifting into evening, the oak trees shivering in the autumn wind. Edward leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he slept without bitterness, knowing the storm ahead would be fierce, but that his name, their name, would not be forgotten. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, seasoned with rosemary the way Helen used to make it. For a moment, when Edward stepped through the door of his daughter's house, he almost forgot how much things had changed. He could almost imagine Helen in the kitchen, humming to herself, her apron dotted with flour as she turned to him with that smile that made even the hardest days worthwhile. But it wasn't Helen at the stove. It was Peter, carving meat with the precision of a man reading numbers from a ledger. The invitation had been brief. Laura had sent him a text earlier that afternoon. "Dinner at 7. Come if you'd like." It was not the warm call of a daughter eager to see her father. It was a formality, the way one might extend courtesy to a neighbor. Still, Edward had come. Fathers come. No matter how cold the welcome, no matter how silent the house, they show up because that is what fathers do. The dining room was immaculate. The oak table, long and polished, bore none of the scratches from years of family life. The old one, the one still sitting in Edward's home, had stories carved into it. Marks from when Andrew had banged his fork in impatience. Lines from Laura's crayons when she colored outside the paper. Helen had refused to sand them away, saying, "These are not blemishes, Edward, they are memories." Now the table in Laura's house was spotless, shining under the overhead light, more showroom than home. "Dad," Laura said as he walked in, her tone polite but clipped. She didn't rise to hug him. Andrew muttered a greeting without lifting his eyes from the wine he was pouring. Peter simply continued slicing, his jaw set in concentration as though Edward were invisible. Edward smiled anyway. He placed his old coat on the rack, adjusted his tie, and sat where Laura gestured. He tried to remember that this was family. They ate in near silence, the clinking of forks and knives filling the gaps. Conversation, when it came, was sterile. They spoke of investors, projections, quarterly returns. The words felt like smoke around Edward, choking, filling the air with something foreign. He listened as though at a stranger's table. At last, searching for a thread, Edward said softly, "The chicken is good, Laura. You've grown into your mother's cooking." For a fleeting second, silence hung, thick and uncomfortable. Then Laura set her fork down, her eyes cold but steady. "Dad," she said, her voice level, rehearsed, "we need to talk." Edward straightened slightly. Something in her tone told him this was no ordinary conversation. Laura looked to Andrew, then to Peter. Both gave small nods as though lines had been rehearsed in a play. Then she spoke again. "You've done enough for this family, for the company. No one denies that, but it's time you step aside. You're not part of the future we're building anymore." The words struck harder than any blow Edward had taken in his life. He blinked slowly. "Not part," he repeated, his voice barely audible. Laura's chin lifted. "We can't move forward if we're tied to the past. Investors don't want a founder hovering. They want confidence in new leadership. You've had your time. Now it's ours." Andrew shifted in his seat. He looked uncomfortable, but he didn't speak. His silence, his avoidance of his father's gaze, hurt more than words. Edward felt a tremor in his chest. His eyes moved from Andrew, his son, the boy who once climbed on his shoulders shouting, "Daddy, higher," to Laura, his daughter, whose hand he once held crossing busy streets, whose hair Helen had braided with gentle fingers. And here she sat, cool and unflinching, delivering the verdict that he was no longer family. Peter cleared his throat, leaning forward as if to take control of the meeting. His voice was smooth, polished, the voice of a man who had never spent a day with mud on his boots or sweat on his brow. "Edward," he said, "it's not personal, it's business. You should be proud. Few men leave behind something so strong their children can carry it without them. Take it as a compliment." A compliment. Edward almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the absurdity of it. A compliment to be erased from the table you built, to be cast aside by the very children who bore your name. He thought of nights on scaffolding under freezing winds, of his cracked hands wrapping sandwiches Helen had packed him. He thought of the years when payroll nearly broke them, when he and Helen cut corners on their own lives so their workers could be paid. He thought of Christmas mornings when Andrew unwrapped gifts Edward couldn't afford, bought with hours stolen from his own rest. He thought of the piano Laura had begged for, how Helen cried when they finally wheeled it into the house. All of it, every sacrifice, every choice, every drop of sweat. And now his reward was this, to be told that his name, his presence, his fatherhood no longer mattered. Edward placed his fork gently on his plate. The sound rang louder than he intended, echoing in the silence. He steadied his hands, not wanting them to see him shake. He looked at Andrew. "Do you believe this too?" Andrew hesitated, his jaw tightened. He glanced at Peter, then back at his father. "Dad, it's for the best. You've done enough. Let us carry it now." Edward turned to Laura. "And you, my daughter, do you truly believe I'm no longer part of this family?" Laura did not blink. "I believe you've given what you could. It's time to let us lead without interference." Without interference. The words landed like a knife. For Edward, family had never been about interference. It had been about showing up, about carrying burdens quietly, about standing in the shadows so his children could stand in the light. And now they used that very shadow as proof he no longer belonged. His throat tightened. He took in the scene, wine glasses half full, the gleam of silverware, the calm composure of the three across from him. He realized then that this table, once the symbol of belonging, had become a courtroom, and his children had just pronounced judgment. Slowly, Edward rose from his chair. He did not slam his hand on the table, did not shout. That was not his way. His dignity was the only thing they could not strip from him. He placed his napkin neatly by the plate, then looked at them, Andrew, Laura, Peter. His voice, when it came, was steady but laced with sorrow. "You may erase me from your plans. You may even erase me from your pictures, but you cannot erase me from myself, and you cannot erase what I have built." No one spoke. Laura's jaw remained firm. Andrew's eyes dropped to the table. Peter pursed his lips, already calculating how this conversation would affect the next board meeting. Edward put on his coat. He felt older than his years, but also strangely clearer. As he opened the door to leave, he glanced once more at his daughter's immaculate home. No scratches on the table, no crayon marks on the walls, no echoes of the messy love that once filled a house with laughter. "Good night," he said quietly and closed the door behind him. Outside, the night air was sharp, cutting into his lungs. He walked slowly to his car, his shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. He could still hear faint laughter inside, the sound of plates being cleared, of life moving on without him. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at his hands on the steering wheel. They were hands that had carried beams, lifted bricks, signed contracts, wiped away children's tears. Hands that had built the very foundation those inside now stood on. And yet those hands had just been declared unnecessary. Edward closed his eyes. In the darkness, Helen's voice came back to him, as if from the years when she stood beside him, painting the first company sign. "A name is not just a word, Edward, it's a promise. Don't let anyone take that promise away." He exhaled, a long, weary breath. He had lost his place at their table, yes, but he had not lost himself. And he still carried the one thing they had forgotten, the name. As the engine hummed to life, Edward drove into the night, his briefcase on the seat beside him. Inside it, the papers waited, quiet, patient, powerful. The very name they thought they could erase was still his to keep, still his to reclaim. And in that silence, broken only by the rhythm of tires on asphalt, Edward Lane began to understand. Sometimes, the cruelest words from your family are not the end of your story. Sometimes, they are the beginning of something you must take back. The morning after that dinner, Edward rose early. Sleep had been a restless guest, visiting only in brief, fractured moments. He had sat most of the night at his kitchen table, a mug of cold coffee at his elbow, staring at the quiet house around him. Helen's photograph smiled from the mantel as though nothing had changed, yet everything had. He left before dawn, driving through the pale light that stretched over rooftops and leafless trees. The roads were nearly empty, the town still wrapped in the drowsiness of morning. His hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, veins standing out against skin worn from years of labor. He knew where he was going. He had to see it with his own eyes. The company headquarters loomed ahead, a building that seemed far taller now than when he first broke ground decades earlier. He had once stood on that empty lot with Helen at his side, her arm looped through his, both of them gazing at the blueprints as though they were glimpsing the future itself. She had whispered, "One day our children will walk through those doors with pride." Edward parked and stepped out. His breath misted in the chilly air as he looked up at the facade. The glass gleamed cold and sharp, reflecting a sun that had not yet fully risen. He approached the front entrance, his shoes crunching against gravel and frost. Then he saw it. The plaque. It was gone. For 30 years, the brass plate had hung proudly by the front doors. Founded by Edward Lane, 1995. Every client who walked into that building had seen it. Every employee had brushed past it. It was more than metal. It was the physical stamp of his life, the acknowledgement of where everything began. And now there was nothing but clean wall. Fresh paint covered the holes where the bolts had once been. Edward's throat tightened. He reached out instinctively, his fingertips brushing against the blank surface, as though touching absence itself. Inside, through the glass doors, a receptionist smiled politely but avoided his eyes. Beyond her, the lobby looked different, sleeker, modernized, its walls lined with glowing screens that showcased glossy logos and slogans. Next-gen construction, building beyond tomorrow. The word Lane was nowhere to be seen. Edward stepped inside. The polished floor reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, each step echoing like a stranger's. Employees passed by briskly, nodding in polite recognition but not pausing to speak. He could see it in their eyes, uncertainty, sympathy they dared not express. He approached the reception desk. "Where is the founder's plaque?" he asked quietly. The young woman's smile faltered. "Mr. Lane, I'm not sure. They removed it yesterday during renovations. I think Mr. Grant gave the order." Peter. Edward felt the name like a bitter taste in his mouth. "Thank you," he murmured. He turned, slowly scanning the lobby once more. Gone were the photos of construction crews shaking hands, the framed newspaper article celebrating the company's first major project, the portrait of Helen standing beside him in front of their very first office. In their place were abstract designs, words about progress and innovation, stock images of skylines that bore no trace of the sweat that had built them. It was as though history itself had been scrubbed clean. Edward walked back outside. The sun was rising now, gilding the glass in orange light. He looked again at the blank wall where his name had once gleamed. His jaw tightened. This is how it begins, he thought. They erase you from the wall, from the sign, from memory. First the plaque, then the photographs, then the name itself. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in the workshop with Helen. She was painting the letters on the wooden sign they had hung above their first office. Lane Builders. Her brush strokes were steady, her smile radiant. A name isn't just letters, Edward. It's the soul of what we're giving people. Don't ever let it be treated as decoration. He whispered aloud now, his voice trembling. They've treated it as decoration, Helen, and now they've stripped it away. A security guard stepped outside, glancing at him with mild concern. Everything all right, Mr. Lane? Edward straightened his shoulders. Yes, he said firmly, though his chest ached. Everything's fine. But it wasn't. On the drive home, Edward's mind churned. Each memory pressed against him, the sweat-soaked shirts, the nights spent hunched over bills, Helen's laughter echoing in the half-finished office. He remembered Andrew and Laura visiting the site as children, their tiny hands smudged with dust, Andrew running between beams, Laura drawing crooked hearts on planks of wood. Back then, they had been proud to be Lanes. Now they tore the name from walls as though it were a stain. By the time Edward reached his house, his resolve had hardened. He went straight to the study, unlocked the wooden box Helen had left him, and lifted the envelope once more. He spread the documents across the desk, smoothing them carefully. There it was, the trademark registration, his signature, Helen's name as witness, the seal of the state. The Lane name was not theirs to erase. He felt an ember of strength stir inside him, quiet but certain. For weeks, he had endured the slow bleed of humiliation, being pushed from meetings, excluded from photographs, stripped from plaques. But here, in ink that had not faded, was proof that his legacy still lived, and no amount of fresh paint or polished slogans could take it away. The following day, Edward returned to Mason Clark's office. He carried the papers under his arm, not with hesitation this time, but with intent. Mason greeted him with a knowing look. "You saw it, didn't you?" Edward nodded once. "The plaque, the name, everything." Mason gestured for him to sit. "Then it's time, Edward. You've given them every chance, but if they've chosen to erase you, the law gives you the right to erase their claim instead." Edward placed the documents on the desk, his hand steady. "Do it. Draft the notice." Mason studied him for a long moment. "You understand, once this begins, there's no turning back. They'll fight you. They'll be angry." Edward's eyes, pale and tired yet firm, met Mason's. They were angry already. "They told me I wasn't part of the family. Now I'll show them what it means when the family name no longer belongs to them." That night, Edward sat alone in his living room, the family portrait still hanging on the wall without his name. He didn't take it down. He let it stay, a reminder of what had been lost. He poured himself a glass of water, stared into the shadows, and whispered again to Helen. "They've taken me off the wall, Helen, but tomorrow I'll remind them the wall was built on my name, and that name still breathes." Edward Lane found the letter on a Thursday evening, tucked at the bottom of the wooden box he had opened and closed so many times in the past weeks. He had been searching again for reassurance, something tangible, a reminder that he was not simply losing his mind. The trademark papers had already steadied him, but tonight he needed more. His house felt too quiet. The air pressed in on him, and so, with weary hands, he reached deeper than before. His fingertips brushed against paper softer, older than the legal documents above it. He drew it out slowly, his breath catching as the envelope came into view. His name was written across the front in a familiar script, slanted, elegant, unmistakable, Helen's handwriting. For a long moment, Edward simply held it. He traced each letter of his name as though touching the strokes of her hand could bring her back. Then, with trembling fingers, he slid the flap open. Inside lay 3 sheets of lined paper, folded carefully. He unfolded them and began to read. "My dearest Edward, if you are reading this, I am gone. Or perhaps I am only gone from the room, not from your heart. I know you will keep me close, even when you tell yourself you must be strong. I leave this letter because I know how you carry the weight of others in silence. And I know one day silence might feel too heavy and you will need my voice again." Edward closed his eyes. He could hear her. He could hear her, the way she used to speak when they sat on the porch after long days, when her words were not commands or questions, but offerings of comfort. "Edward, there may come a time when even our children forget. Not because they are cruel, though it will feel that way, but because the world teaches them to chase things faster than memory. There may come a time when they will see you as the past, not the present, and it will break you if you let it, but don't. Don't let them take away what you are. Remember this, a name is not decoration. It is not branding, it is a covenant. You gave it to this company with your sweat and your honesty. You gave it to our children with your devotion. It is the one thing that should not be discarded. Protect it, Edward. If the day ever comes when you feel erased, use the tools we put in place. That is why I insisted on the papers you now hold. It was not caution, it was love. I wanted to be sure your name, our name, could not be stolen." Edward's eyes blurred with tears. He pressed the page to his lips, breathing in the faintest trace of lavender that seemed to cling to it even after all these years. Helen had known. She had known. He continued reading. "If you stand one day before the world and they tell you that you no longer belong, remember that I believe you do. Even when I am no longer there to speak it aloud, my belief stands. I have always trusted that you would do what is right, even when it hurt. If you must act, Edward, act not from anger but from dignity. Act so that when you look in the mirror you see not a man cast aside but a man who stood tall for what mattered. And if the children forget, love them still. Love them in your heart even if you must walk away from their table. One day perhaps they will remember. And if they do, it should not be your anger they find waiting but your love. Always, always yours, Helen." The letter slipped from Edward's hand onto the table. He leaned back in his chair, covering his face. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, years of buried grief and new betrayal flowing together. He had held himself like stone in front of Andrew, Laura, and Peter. But here, in the presence of Helen's words, he allowed himself to break. He wept for her absence, for the children who had turned from him, for the years that seemed suddenly empty. He wept until his chest ached and his breath came in ragged gasps, and then slowly the weeping quieted. He sat for a long while in silence, the letter spread before him, the house holding its breath. He reached for a pen. On the back of an old envelope he wrote a single sentence, "I will not let our name be stolen." He underlined it twice. The next day Edward returned to the office. He did not go to the conference room. He did not sit quietly in a chair at the side. Instead, he asked the receptionist to deliver an envelope directly to Peter Grant. Inside was Mason Clark's formal letter, the revocation of the license to use the Lane name. While he waited in the lobby, employees passed by with puzzled looks. Some gave him respectful nods. Others glanced nervously at the envelope in his hand. He said nothing. He sat with his briefcase at his side, Helen's letter folded neatly in his pocket as if her presence itself steadied him. Minutes later, Andrew appeared. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "Dad, what is this?" he demanded, holding up the letter. Edward looked at him calmly. "It is what it says. You no longer have the right to use our name." Laura appeared behind her brother, her voice rising. "Dad, you can't do this. The company, our lives, are tied to that name." Edward stood slowly, his posture straight despite the years. "You told me I was no longer part of this family. You erased me from your photo, from your table, from the wall where my name hung. So I am taking back what was always mine, what was always Helen's, the Lane name." Peter stepped forward, his usual composure cracking. "Edward, this is madness. Do you realize what you're doing? Contracts, investors, branding, all of it depends on the Lane name." Edward's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Then perhaps you should not have forgotten who the Lane name belongs to." That evening, Edward returned home. He placed Helen's letter on the mantel beside her photograph. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, filling the room with warmth that no boardroom could match. He whispered to her picture, "I did as you asked. I acted with dignity, and I loved them still even as they forgot me. The house was quiet, but Edward felt less alone. Helen's words had become his shield, and as he prepared for the storm that would come, he carried her letter with him like armor. For the first time in months he slept soundly, because the Lane name, their name, still breathed. The letter from Helen had not left Edward's pocket since the day he discovered it. Folded neatly, it traveled with him like a compass, guiding him each time doubt crept in. When his hands shook at night, when his mind replayed Laura's words, "You're not part of the future we're building anymore," he touched the paper and steadied. Helen had seen this day before he had. She had left him the map, and now he was following it. On Monday morning, Edward walked once more into the brick office of Mason Clark. The secretary smiled politely, but her eyes lingered on him as though she knew something significant was unfolding. Perhaps word had already spread. In small towns it usually did. Mason stood as Edward entered, extending a hand. "Edward," he said, "I expected you." Edward smiled faintly. "You always did have a way of knowing." They sat. The desk between them was stacked with folders, neat piles of paper clipped with steel. Mason adjusted his glasses and drew the revocation letter from his file. "We've delivered notice. That was the first step. The clock is ticking. They have 30 days to comply, to remove the Lane name from all branding, contracts, and signage." Edward nodded slowly. He felt the gravity of those words. 30 days. In 1 month, the walls of his company, their company, would stand stripped of the name that had defined them. It was both victory and sorrow in the same breath. Mason studied him. "I want to be sure, Edward. This isn't just a legal move, it's a declaration. Once the world sees this, there's no undoing it. Are you ready for that?" Edward looked down at his hands. Rough, scarred, still calloused, even though he hadn't laid brick in years. They were the hands of a builder, not a destroyer. He closed them gently, then spoke. "Mason," he said, his voice quiet but resolute, "this was never about revenge. I don't want to ruin my children. I want to remind them. Remind them that a name has weight, that it can't be tossed aside like an old tool. If they cannot see me as family anymore, then they must at least respect the truth, that what they stand on was built by these hands under this name." Mason leaned back, nodding. "Then we proceed. But they will fight you. I expect Peter to rally the board, perhaps even take this to court." Edward's lips curved faintly. "Peter doesn't understand. He thinks in numbers, contracts, forecasts. But this isn't about numbers. It's about memory, about covenant." He touched the pocket where Helen's letter rested. "I have my guide." As Mason drafted the next set of documents, Edward's mind drifted backward, not just years, but decades. He was 29 again, standing on an empty lot with Helen beside him. The sun was hot, the ground dry and uneven. All they had was a stack of lumber, a handful of workers, and faith. He remembered Helen's hair tied back, her sleeves rolled, holding a hammer with more determination than skill. "We'll build it together," she had said. And they had, beam by beam, wall by wall. Edward carried bricks, poured cement, hammered nails until his hands blistered. At night, Helen brought sandwiches for the crew, her laughter lightening their exhaustion. When the sign finally went up, Lane Builders, they had stood back, hand in hand, tears in both their eyes. That memory burned bright now. He had not fought through those years to let the name vanish under Peter's marketing slogans. He had not buried Helen to let her legacy be painted over. He returned to the present as Mason slid papers across the desk. "Here," Mason said, "is the official filing. Once submitted, it will be public record. The Lane name will be recognized legally, formally, as solely yours." Edward read each line carefully. The legal terms were dense, but the heart of it was simple. The Lane name was his. He could revoke it, enforce it, reclaim it. It was not theirs to wield without him. Mason handed him a pen. "All that's left is your signature." Edward hesitated. He thought of Andrew, the boy who once ran to him after school, clutching a report card, eager for his father's approval. He thought of Laura, the girl who once sat at the piano, playing clumsy notes while Helen clapped along. He thought of their laughter, their trust, their innocence. Signing this paper would not erase those memories, but it would mark a line between past and present, between father and children, between name and inheritance. Edward lifted the pen. His hand trembled not from doubt but from the weight of love and loss entwined. He pressed the tip to the page and wrote, "Edward Lane." The ink flowed smooth, unbroken. Mason took the papers gently. "It's done," he said. Edward sat back, exhaling deeply. "No," he whispered, "it's only beginning." News traveled quickly. By the end of the week, whispers reached the town. Employees spoke in hushed tones. "The founder has revoked the name." Clients asked nervous questions. "What happens to our contracts?" Reporters called, sensing a story of family and betrayal too irresistible to ignore. At home, Edward's phone rang again and again. Andrew, Laura, even Peter, he let them ring. He could not hear their voices yet, not until they understood. Instead, he sat at Helen's old piano, running his fingers over the keys though he had never learned to play. The sound was uneven, clumsy. But as he pressed the notes, he imagined Helen's laughter, Laura's small hands next to hers, the house filled with music. The memory both broke and healed him. When the calls stopped, Edward picked up Helen's letter once more. He read the lines until they blurred. "If you must act, Edward, act not from anger, but from dignity. Act so that when you look in the mirror, you see not a man cast aside, but a man who stood tall for what mattered." He whispered into the empty room, "I am trying, Helen, I am trying." The 30 days had begun. The law was on his side. The children had choices to make. And Edward Lane, though weary and wounded, had chosen his path. The path of dignity, the path of promise, the path of the name. The boardroom had changed since the days when Edward presided over it. What once had been a modest oak table, scuffed by years of elbows and coffee mugs, was now a sleek expanse of glass and chrome. The walls that once displayed blueprints of projects were lined with glowing screens that played looping videos of skyscrapers and luxury condos. It felt less like a builder's room and more like the headquarters of a corporation that had forgotten the scent of sawdust. Edward walked into that room on a Tuesday morning, his leather briefcase at his side, his posture upright despite the whispers that followed him down the hallway. Employees exchanged glances, some nodding respectfully, others lowering their eyes as though afraid to be seen. Everyone knew why he was there. The letter he had served was no longer a rumor. It was a storm cloud hovering over the company. At the head of the table sat Andrew, his tie perfectly knotted, his face pale but composed. Beside him, Laura sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. Peter leaned back in his chair with arms crossed, eyes sharp with calculation. Around them, board members and senior managers shuffled papers, waiting for whatever was about to happen. Edward set his briefcase on the table and remained standing. He looked around the room at the men and women he had hired years ago, some still loyal, others swayed by the newer generation. He cleared his throat. The room quieted instantly. For 30 years, Edward began, his voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of decades. This company has carried my name. Lane Builders was not just a business, it was a promise, to build with honesty, to stand by our work, to honor the people who trusted us. That name was forged with sweat and sacrifice, not just mine, but of every worker who ever lifted a beam or laid a brick under the Lane banner. He paused, letting his gaze travel slowly around the table. The silence was taut, a string pulled to the breaking point. But in recent weeks, he continued, I have been told that I am no longer part of the family. My name was removed from the wall, from the plaque, from the company's story. My own children believe the Lane name is a relic to be discarded. Laura shifted in her chair. Andrew's jaw tightened. Edward opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder. He placed it on the table, sliding copies of the revocation letter toward the executives nearest him. As the registered and legal owner of the Lane trademark, I am here to announce that effective immediately, the company no longer has the right to use the Lane name. Gasps rippled around the room. Papers rustled. One executive whispered audibly, "Good Lord." Peter shot to his feet. "You can't do this," he barked, his composure cracking. "This company is Lane Builders. Every contract, every investor deal, they all depend on that name." Edward met his gaze evenly. You should have thought of that before you erased me. Andrew stood now, palms flat on the table. Dad, listen to yourself. You're destroying everything you built. Edward's voice softened, but his words struck harder. No, Andrew, you destroyed it the moment you decided the name no longer mattered. You wanted to move forward without me. Then do it. But you will do it without my name. The room fell silent again. Board members glanced at one another, uneasy. They understood the implications. Contracts would have to be reissued, signage torn down, advertising campaigns scrapped. Investors would demand answers. Millions could be lost. Laura's voice, sharp and desperate, broke the quiet. Dad, you're punishing us, punishing your own family. Edward looked at her, his eyes heavy with sorrow. No, Laura, I am reminding you, you do not get to erase the man who gave you this foundation. You do not get to strip meaning from a name built on love, on sacrifice, on your mother's belief that honesty mattered more than profit. If you won't honor it, you won't use it. Peter slammed a hand on the table. We'll fight you. We'll take this to court. The board won't stand for it. Edward straightened his shoulders. You can fight. You can go to court. But the law is on my side. And more than that, so is the truth. When people see headlines about children erasing their father from his own company, tell me, Peter, who will they stand with? Murmurs spread. Executives shifted uncomfortably. Even those who had sided with Andrew and Peter looked unsettled. Family betrayal was not a good look, no matter how polished the rebrand. Edward let the silence grow. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of what they had done. Finally, he gathered his papers, slid them back into his briefcase, and looked one last time around the room. You have 30 days, he said. Remove the Lane name, every sign, every contract, every shred of branding. After that, any use of the name will be a violation of federal trademark law. He turned to leave. Dad, wait. Andrew's voice cracked, breaking through his polished exterior. For the first time, he looked less like a CEO and more like the boy who once sat on Edward's shoulders, begging to see the world from higher ground. Please, don't do this. Edward paused at the door. His hand rested on the frame. He did not turn back. You told me I wasn't family anymore, he said quietly. I am only giving you what you asked for. And then he walked out, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence. That afternoon, news spread like wildfire. By evening, the town paper had published a story. Founder revokes family company's right to his name. The article detailed the conflict, quoting anonymous employees who spoke of betrayal and loyalty, of a father cast out by his own children. On social media, the story exploded. Pictures of Edward, stoic, weary, but dignified, circulated alongside headlines. Some users called him a hero for standing his ground. Others debated the cruelty of children who would erase their father. Investors demanded clarity. Contracts trembled on the edge of collapse. At home, Edward sat quietly in his armchair, the fire crackling low. Helen's letter rested on the table beside him. He did not smile at the chaos, nor did he revel in victory. He simply stared into the flames, whispering, I did what you asked, Helen. I acted with dignity. The phone rang again and again. Andrew, Laura, Peter. He did not answer. Some conversations had to wait until hearts remembered what mattered. For now, Edward Lane had spoken, and the world had heard. The first signs of change appeared not in headlines or boardrooms, but on the streets. For 3 decades, the golden letters of Lane Builders had stood proudly above construction sites across the city. They were painted on scaffolding, nailed to fences, draped across banners fluttering in the wind. They were promises in plain sight. If it carried the Lane name, it would stand strong. But a week after Edward's announcement, workers began to arrive at sites and find crews with drills and ladders waiting. One by one, the signs came down. The letters L-A-N-E were unscrewed, carried off in boxes like broken relics. Boards were stripped bare, leaving only pale outlines where the sun had faded around the name. Drivers passing by slowed to watch. Some honked, some shook their heads. One old man on a bicycle stopped and muttered, "Never thought I'd see the day." Inside the company, the mood shifted like a building trembling at its foundations. Secretaries whispered in hallways. Project managers fielded anxious calls from clients. Is my contract still valid? Will this delay construction? Do we need to renegotiate? Some threatened lawsuits, others demanded discounts. Investors flooded Andrew's inbox, demanding explanations. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was frantic. Laura sat hunched over spreadsheets, her voice sharp with panic. Do you know what this means? Every single document bearing the Lane name has to be revised. Every contract, every license, every advertisement. This isn't just rebranding, this is chaos. Peter finished, slamming a file shut. His face, usually smug and composed, was drawn tight with frustration. Do you realize how much this will cost us? Millions, maybe more. And the longer the name lingers on signage, the greater the legal liability. Andrew rubbed his temples, the weight of the company pressing down on his shoulders. We'll have to reissue everything under a new name, but we don't even have a name yet. Next Gen Construction, Peter said quickly. We already tested it with investors. Laura shot him a look. Investors didn't know they'd be losing Lane. That was the draw, the credibility. You think anyone cares about Next Gen? It sounds like a tech startup. Andrew's voice cracked as he muttered, Dad's destroyed us. But deep down, even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. Edward hadn't destroyed them. He had simply reminded them what they had chosen to forget. Meanwhile, Edward heard about the fallout not from newspapers but from neighbors. At the diner where he ate breakfast, whispers followed him. That's him, someone said softly, the founder who took back his name. Good for him, another replied. Man deserves respect. A young waitress refilled his coffee and leaned close. My uncle worked for Lane Builders when you started, she whispered. He always said you treated the men better than anyone, just thought you should know people remember. Edward nodded, his throat tight. He didn't come for praise, but the words warmed him nonetheless. Back at headquarters, chaos spread. Emails poured in from legal teams. Trucks delivered fresh signs, hastily printed with the new branding, Next Gen Construction. Workers nailed them up at sites, but the name looked flimsy, awkward, like a suit too big for the man wearing it. Clients frowned. What happened to Lane? They asked. The answers never satisfied. In one meeting, a longtime partner pounded the table. We signed with Lane Builders because of Lane, because of Edward. If the name's gone, so are we. He stormed out, contracts shredded in his wake. Andrew tried to reassure the board. He spoke with confidence, but his words rang hollow. The truth was evident. Without the Lane name, the company was adrift. Laura, more pragmatic, whispered late at night to Peter, maybe we should have listened. Maybe we went too far. Peter's reply was bitter. He forced our hand. He'll regret this when the company collapses. But as weeks passed, it wasn't Edward who looked like the villain. It was Andrew, Laura, and Peter. News outlets painted the story as a modern tragedy. Children erasing their father, only to lose the very foundation he gave them. Public sympathy swelled for Edward. Investors backed away from the company, wary of the scandal. The Lane name, though removed from signs, lived louder than ever in headlines, in whispers, in the loyalty of workers who remembered who had built their livelihoods. One evening, Edward drove past an old construction site. The new sign, Next Gen Construction, hung crooked on the fence. Wind tugged at its edges, peeling the corners. Beneath it, faint but visible, was the outline of the old paint, Lane. The ghost of the name lingered, stubborn against erasure. Edward stopped his car and stared. He thought of Helen again, of her words. A name is not decoration, it's covenant. She had been right. Even stripped from the walls, the name still breathed. He whispered, they can't bury it, Helen, not while I'm alive. And as he drove home, he felt something he hadn't in months. Not just sorrow, but vindication. He hadn't acted in vain. The fallout wasn't proof of destruction. It was proof of truth. The first article appeared in the local paper, a modest column tucked between city council updates and weather forecasts. Founder revokes right to Lane name. At first, it was simply news, a curiosity, a legal dispute between a father and his children. But like sparks in dry grass, the story spread. Within days, regional papers picked it up. Then national outlets, headlines sharpened. Betrayed by blood, children erase father from his own company. Edward Lane takes back the name his family tried to forget, when legacy turns to liability. By the end of the week, Edward's story had become more than a business dispute. It had become a parable. Reporters camped outside the company's headquarters, their cameras capturing every crooked sign being torn down, every contractor shaking his head as he loaded supplies into trucks. One reporter caught an old foreman on camera. The man, his hands still stained with concrete dust, spoke plainly. "I worked with Ed Lane back when we didn't have enough nails to finish a project. He'd work alongside us, shoulder to shoulder. Fed us sandwiches his wife made when pay was late. That company was him. Without him, without his name, it's just walls with no foundation." The clip went viral. At Edward's home, the phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted statements. Old friends wanted to offer support. Strangers wrote letters, some mailed, some slid under his door. One note read, "Mr. Lane, I never met you, but I hope my children never forget me the way yours did you. Thank you for reminding the world what a name means." Edward read them quietly, his heart heavy yet warmed. He had not sought fame nor pity, but it seemed the truth had spoken louder than he ever could. He carried Helen's letter in his pocket, unfolding it often as he watched the storm grow. Each time he read her words act not from anger but from dignity. He reminded himself to stay silent amid the noise. Let the world talk. Let them see. Meanwhile, at company headquarters, Andrew, Laura, and Peter faced questions sharper than any lawsuit. Reporters shouted outside board meetings. "Why did you erase your father from the company? Do you regret telling him he was no longer part of the family? Was profit more important than legacy?" Andrew ducked cameras, his polished suit doing little to hide the strain etched into his face. Laura tried to keep her composure, but her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Peter snapped once, barking at a journalist, "You don't know the full story." The clip spread online with captions mocking him. "The son-in-law who forgot who built the house." Investors panicked. Contracts fell through. Clients demanded answers. The more the family tried to spin the narrative that Edward was outdated, that modernization required a new image, the more hollow their words sounded. Because truth has a way of shining through. And the truth was simple. Edward Lane had built a company with integrity. His children had tried to erase him, and now the world was watching them pay the price. On social media, the story took on a life of its own. Hashtags trended. #remember the builder, #respect Edward, #Lane means legacy. Photos of Edward circulated, him walking quietly into Mason Clark's office, him sipping coffee at the diner, him standing by the oak tree in front of his home. In each image, he looked weary but dignified, a symbol of a generation whose sacrifices had been forgotten by the very children they made them for. Videos resurfaced of old interviews Edward had given years earlier, talking about his philosophy. "You build honest, you build to last. That's the Lane way." People shared those clips, contrasting them with Peter's sleek speeches about innovation. The contrast spoke for itself. Even former employees came forward, sharing stories of Edward's kindness. One told of how Edward personally drove him to the hospital after an accident on site. Another recalled Edward paying his rent out of pocket during a rough winter. Each story was another brick in the truth being laid bare. Edward watched it all with quiet astonishment. At the diner, strangers shook his hand. In the grocery store, a young father stopped him. "Mr. Lane," he said, holding his toddler's hand, "thank you. You reminded me to be present for him, to make sure he knows who built the roof over his head." Edward nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "That's all any of us want," he whispered. But for all the public support, Edward's heart still ached. At night, he sat by Helen's photograph and admitted the truth. "The world sees me, Helen, but my children, they don't. And I'd trade all of this just to hear them call me Dad again." In the boardroom, desperation mounted. Andrew slammed his fist on the table. "We can't survive this. Every time we speak, it makes us look worse. We need Dad to stop." Laura's voice cracked. "Do you think he'll listen after what we said, after what we did?" Peter leaned forward, his tone sharp. "We'll take him to court, challenge the trademark, drag this out until he gives in." But even as he said it, Andrew shook his head. The people won't stand with us. Look around. We're the villains now, not Dad, us. Silence fell. For the first time they realized they had lost something greater than contracts or investors. They had lost the story. And stories once lost are impossible to reclaim. Edward's truth had been laid bare, not by his own shouting but by the quiet strength of dignity. The world now knew who he was. And more importantly, the world knew what his children had done. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each chime echoing like an accusation through the hollow walls. Andrew sat at the dining table, his shoulders hunched, papers scattered in front of him, unpaid bills, foreclosure notices, letters marked in red. His jaw was tight, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Across from him, Laura paced back and forth, her bare feet tapping against the wooden floor like a metronome of rising tension. "This is your fault," she snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You insisted we didn't need Dad's help anymore, that we could handle things on our own. And now look at us, we've lost everything." Andrew slammed his palm against the table, rattling the glasses that still sat there from their uneaten dinner. "Don't you dare put this on me, Laura. You were the one who pushed him away first. You said his way was old-fashioned, that his presence made us look weak in front of others. You wanted independence. Well, here it is. Independence comes with a cost." Laura stopped pacing and stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never wanted this. I wanted to feel like we could stand on our own. But we turned our backs on the man who built this house, who gave us everything. We acted like his sacrifices meant nothing." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, neither of them had a retort. From the corner of the room, Peter, their teenage son, had been listening. He had tried to stay quiet, tucked away with his headphones, but their voices pierced through. Stood now, his young face twisted in anger and confusion. "Do you even hear yourselves?" Peter's voice trembled, not with fear but with the sharpness of betrayal. "Grandpa was the only one who ever cared about me without expecting anything in return. He showed up at my games when you were too busy. He fixed my bike, he listened when I talked. And you both told him he wasn't part of the family anymore. Do you know what that did to him?" Andrew's face paled. "Peter, you don't understand." "I understand enough," Peter shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. "You treated him like he was a burden, but everything we have, this house, this life, it was because of him, and now it's gone because you couldn't see past your pride." Laura covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "Peter," but the boy shook his head, stepping back as if even their comfort would stain him. His voice dropped, quiet but sharp as glass. "You broke him, and in breaking him, you broke us." The words cut deeper than any argument between Andrew and Laura. They came not from resentment but from truth, the truth spoken by a child who had witnessed the fracture of a family's foundation. Silence reclaimed the room, heavy and suffocating. Andrew sank into his chair, staring at the table as if the wood grain itself could offer absolution. His voice, when it came, was a whisper of defeat. "I thought I was proving something, that I could be more than just the son who relied on his father. But all I proved was that I was blind. Blind to the fact that Dad wasn't holding me back, he was holding me up." Laura sat across from him, her hands trembling as she wrung them together. "We were so busy trying to live without his shadow that we forgot he was the very light that guided us. And now," she looked around the room at the peeling paint, at the stack of unpaid bills, at the empty spaces that once held laughter. "Now we have nothing." Peter's eyes softened, but the pain remained. "You still have him," he said quietly, "but you'll have to earn back what you threw away." The weight of those words pressed on Andrew and Laura like a sentence they could not escape. The house was no longer just brick and wood. It had become a monument to their ingratitude, every crack in the walls a reminder of the cracks in their hearts. That night Andrew couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sobs of Laura down the hall. Memories of his father rushed back. The steady hands that built their porch, the voice that told him never to give up, the weary smile after long days of work. He remembered the day they told Richard, his father, that he was no longer welcome. He remembered the flicker in his father's eyes, a mixture of pain and resignation before he quietly left the house he had built with his own 2 hands. Andrew pressed his palms against his face, shame burning like fire. "What have I done?" he whispered into the darkness. Down the hall, Laura clutched an old photo frame, one she had kept tucked away in the closet. It was of her wedding day, with Richard standing proudly beside them, his hand on Andrew's shoulder, his smile wide and full of hope. She traced his face with her fingertips, her tears smudging the glass. "We pushed away the man who loved us most," she whispered. "And for what? For pride, for appearances." The dawn came cold and gray, a mirror of the heaviness in their hearts. When the sun finally spilled weak light into the kitchen, Andrew and Laura sat across from each other once more, but this time there was no anger, only regret. "We have to make it right," Andrew said at last, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how, but we can't let this be the end. He deserves better than the way we treated him." Laura nodded slowly, her eyes swollen but resolute. "We can't undo the past, but maybe we can show him that we've learned, that we finally understand what he gave us." Peter entered the room then, his school bag slung over his shoulder. He looked at them with the weariness of someone who had seen too much too young. For a moment, Andrew thought his son would walk past them without a word, but instead Peter paused. "If you mean it," he said softly, "then do it. Don't just say it, show him. Show Grandpa you're not the same people who pushed him away." Andrew met Laura's eyes. For the first time in months, maybe years, they both felt the same thing, not pride, not defiance, but the weight of responsibility. Because the price of ingratitude was not just losing the roof over their heads. It was losing the man who had given them everything. And now they had to face the hardest truth of all, that the foundation of family is not built on pride, but on love, and they had torn theirs apart with their own hands. And if they wanted to rebuild, it would cost them more than money. It would cost humility, repentance, and a willingness to be the children Richard deserved. The once bustling house now stood in silence. The laughter, the footsteps, the warmth, it was gone. Andrew and Laura sat in the empty living room, their voices hushed, their hearts heavy. They looked around and realized this was not just a house. It was their father's life, his sacrifice, his love built into every wall and corner. And now, through their own ingratitude, they had lost it. The silence was unbearable. For the first time, they understood the depth of what Peter had given them. But the understanding came too late. The house no longer belonged to them, and neither did the peace they once took for granted. All that remained was the echo of a lesson, that when you fail to honor love and sacrifice, you risk losing everything. Thank you for watching this story. May it remind us all never to take our loved ones for granted, especially the parents who quietly built the foundation of our lives. Wishing you health, peace, and happiness with your families.